Around 1400 AD, something big happened here in the Southwest. Whole cultures disappeared. Thousands of people moved away from their homes, completely depopulating whole regions, in an event I like to call the Great Calamity. Now, nobody really knows what happened in 1400 here in the Southwest. A lot of people have guessed about it. All I'm doing here is taking some information, some facts that have been established by archaeology, and I'm going to make some guesses. I'm going to give them to you and let you make some guesses. So if we go back in time, way, way back, to the beginning of some of these cultures in the Southwest, around the time of Christ, let's say 1 AD, in that time, most people around the Southwest were hunter-gatherers. They traveled around collecting wild plants and hunting to get their food. And then around 200, 300 AD, agriculture started to be introduced here. And some of these people started to settle down and become settled agricultural people. Agriculture arrived here at around the same time that ceramics, pottery did. And pottery and agriculture kind of developed and evolved together here in the Southwest, because pottery made it possible to store your crops, to store your seeds and your grains away from rodents and other pests. Over the course of centuries, these cultures evolved. They became more and more sophisticated as time went on. The pottery types became more sophisticated. Their agriculture became more sophisticated. Their architecture became more sophisticated. As time went on, these cultures evolved. And in different regions around the Southwest, these cultures evolved differently because of the settings they were in, their surroundings. So up in the northern Southwest, they might refer to that as ancestral Puebloan today, but they used to call that Anasazi culture. That was the culture that lived in that area. It's defined by a certain type of pottery, certain type of architecture, certain types of ceremonies. Down in the desert Southwest, near Phoenix and Tucson, they have the Hohokam. And farther west, over in southern New Mexico, they have the Members. So they have these different cultures in different areas. And in all of these areas, the people seem to have been roughly the same people that had been hunter-gatherers in those areas. They stayed in the area and they continued to evolve their culture over time. Think about this, though. These were hardy people. These were people that were used to dealing with problems like droughts and diseases and sicknesses. They lived a hard life out there on the land. This is a hard country. It's sometimes very dry. It's often very hot or very cold. And these people dealt with that. They were very tough, hardy people. They weren't easily dissuaded by a little bit of difficulty or uncomfortableness, the way people today are. Let's look at that over the course of centuries. Here's these hardy people living on the land. They developed from hunter-gatherers into these sophisticated, elaborate cultures. Now let's move forward to about the apex of many of these cultures, where they reached their peak was right around the 1300s. And the reason that the peak was around 1300s for some of these cultures was because many of these cultures ceased to exist right around 1400. Now let's establish some basic guidelines here. And the first one I want to establish is there are no coincidences. Well, there really are coincidences sometimes, but often when several different things happen at the same time in history, it indicates that those things are related, that they're connected in some way. And so when we see a lot of these cultures disappear at exactly the same moment in history, that should tell us something. That should make our spidey senses start to tingle as we try to figure out what was going on. Here we are looking at the Southwest in 1400 AD. We have all these sophisticated cultures across the landscape. Most of them have lived in the same area for many centuries. Let's start in the far northwestern portion of this area. Let's look at the Verde Valley. If you're not familiar with the Southwest, or Arizona in particular, the Verde Valley runs from roughly Flagstaff, Arizona, south to almost Phoenix. And in that area, the culture is called by archaeologists the Sinawa. And again, these people had lived here for centuries. They dealt with droughts and many, many hardships. In 1400 AD, these people all left. The entire valley was depopulated. Well, that's peculiar, isn't it? Since they had dealt with probably wars and famines and droughts and all these things in the past and had not abandoned their homeland. Let's look at a different area. Let's look farther south. There in the desert valleys around Phoenix and Tucson, where the culture is called Hohokam. These are the same people that had lived there for centuries, had dealt with all kinds of turmoil over the years, had built this elaborate, sophisticated culture. Around 1400, they completely depopulated that area. They up and left, all of them. Now let's move a little farther to the east from there. Along the Mogollon Rim, in the upper Little Colorado River Valley, and then south from there all the way to the Gila, Mogollon people lived. And they had lived there for centuries. Around 1400, they all left. Everybody. The entire region was depopulated. From that area further east, almost all the way to the Rio Grande River in New Mexico, where there had been Salado people living along the Gila and other places, all the way down to today's U.S.-Mexican border, completely depopulated in 1400. I'm not done, though. I'm not done. From the U.S.-Mexican border in, say, New Mexico, Arizona, farther south and a little east was the Casas Grandes culture. Now, this was one of the biggest, most elaborate, most sophisticated cultures in the entire Southwest, in all of history. They had this huge city in Paquime, and they had all kinds of elaborate things. They were raising parrots and turkeys in specialized pens. They might have been doing copper smelting. They were making sophisticated pottery. They had an elaborate trade network. You know what happened to these people? Around 1400, it ceased to exist. It completely disappeared, and all the people left. Okay, now each of these in themselves would be peculiar, given that those same people had lived there for centuries, they had dealt with drought and all these difficulties in the past. What would make them all leave? But when you look at it as a regional phenomenon, from Flagstaff all the way to El Paso, right, from south of the Mexican border all the way to the Little Colorado in northern Arizona, that is a massive, massive area that was depopulated. You know, I'm not an archaeologist and I don't play one on TV. I just want to be clear. Okay, these are my ideas. But I don't think people leave because of drought. Some archaeologists will say, oh, they had some dry years right around then and that's why they left. Well, you know, these people had dealt with drought in the past. Or some people will say, well, there were some bad floods around that time and it washed out the head gates to their canals in Phoenix. And so they all left. That explains Phoenix, but that doesn't explain the Verde Valley or the mountains east of there or the Casas Grandes culture. It doesn't really account for the entire region. So, you know, we need to not be blinded and look at a specific area like Phoenix, but look at the whole thing and say, well, even if the floodgates washed out in Phoenix, that doesn't account for the whole region being depopulated. Something much bigger than that happened. Now, we don't know, okay? Archaeologists say we don't have any evidence of warfare. But I don't know, I mean, again, I'm not an archaeologist. I don't know what you're going to expect to find that is evidence of warfare, right? I mean, if they fight out on a battlefield, you're not going to find that battlefield, chances are. You know, maybe you're expecting to see the villages looted and burned. There are quite a few villages that were abandoned in that time frame that were burned. So there is that. But I think if you look at drought as something that is often talked about as something that would make people leave, I think drought makes some people leave, but it doesn't make everybody leave because some places, you know, villages that are built near good springs, villages that are built near good streams and rivers, these are the places that stay, that weather the drought and then spread out from there afterward. It's much bigger than drought. I think the only thing, if you look at world history, you look across at Europe and Asia or South America, other places, I think the only thing that you see that completely depopulates a vast region is warfare. Because the average person just wants to raise their family, you know, raise their crops, look after their home, make sure their children are safe and well fed. And when warfare is going on, you know, you just leave. You just say, I'm just taking my family and getting out of here because this isn't a safe place to live anymore. I just don't think disease, unless it was such a terrible epidemic that it wiped out entire civilizations, which I don't know if there's a precedence for that. You know, the Black Plague was pretty bad in Europe, but it didn't completely, you know, depopulate England or anything. So although there's probably not as much evidence for the warfare, I think that's the only thing we can say would depopulate that region that much. The other thing is, I think we can look at who they were fighting with based on the direction they moved. Most of these people, when they left, they didn't pick up their old culture when they got where they were going. So, for example, when the Salado left the Salado region along the Gila River, they didn't keep making Salado polychrome when they got where they were going, wherever they went. And so it's hard to track these people. But still, we can see that in this depopulated zone, the villages to the north those up in Hopi and Zuni, they probably accepted refugees. They probably acquired people around that time. And people to the south, like the Opata and the Audam, probably accepted refugees. They probably grew at that time. Those were both very, very populous people at the first contact with the Spanish. And so if people moved north and moved south, then it seems like the battle or the fighting was between the people in the north and the people in the south, some kind of conflict where they were, traveling distances and raiding to make villages be depopulated. Just my take on it. This left a huge open area where nobody lived for hundreds of years. Okay, so it was depopulated in 1400. When the Spanish arrived in 1540, they referred to this area as the Despoblado, meaning that it was a depopulated area. They recognized it as depopulated and thought that was odd. They found abandoned ruins in this Despoblado, where people had lived only 100 or so years before. So then, when the Athabascans, the Navajos and the Apaches arrived in the Southwest in the 1600s, they moved right into this empty area. They were looking for a homeland, and there was one ready for them. Not only was it good, fertile land, but it had sat fallow for centuries at this point. 14, 15, 16, 200 years. And so there was lots of game in these areas, lots of deer and elk and these kind of things. So it was really, probably seemed like a paradise to them. So that's the big deal that I call the Great Calamity. We really don't know what it was, but it was definitely a calamity. Anything that would cause that huge of an area to be abandoned had to have been some sort of calamity. And so, if you have some ideas about what it is, leave a comment. It'd be a good place to kind of have a discussion about what you think happened here in 1400. If you're interested in more details about what went on in 1400 and some of the archaeological evidence about what was going on, I go over that in this video right over here. So you can go check that out if you want. Or I also have an ebook that goes into more detail about this as well. And I'll link that up down in the doobly-doo. Thanks for coming with me today. I'll catch you next time. The heck do I keep hearing? Freaking me out. Don't do that, whatever you are.